The epigraph on this title screen reflects common expectations of 20th century female jazz musicians. Well-coiffed, beautiful women might be expected as jazz vocalists in sentimental numbers that required limited musical prowess. But women were just not perceived to be cut out to be professional instrumentalists, especially professional wind players. This critic wrote, "You can forgive them for lacking guts in their playing, but even women should be able to play with feeling and expression." The same critic would go on to remark, quote, "Milady's dimples take an awful beating when reaching for the high ones." That is, for the high notes. Now, despite these perceptions of women in jazz, there were a number of very important jazz women in the 20th century. This video traces a few of their music and lives. We start with two great jazz vocalists, Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald, and then we'll talk about a few of the all-girl jazz orchestras that flourished during the war years. Billie Holiday had one of the most distinctive voices of all 20th century jazz. Born in Philadelphia to an unwed mother, Holiday spent her early childhood in and out of reform schools and even spent time in a workhouse after the 14-year-old and her mother were imprisoned for prostitution. Released, she was able to find work as a singer and gradually built a reputation for powerfully emotional performances. Holiday died in 1959 from liver and heart disease. Her life had not been easy. For much of it, she had suffered abusive relationships with men and been addicted to alcohol and narcotics. Her vocal stylings, however, are nothing short of amazing. The timbres of her voice, the shape of her melodies, the timing of her tempos, all suggest power and vulnerability. You can hear this already in the 1937 recording of Without Your Love that she did with the tenor saxophonist Lester Young. Holiday and Young would spend most of the rest of their lives as best friends and musical partners. Listen to it on your YouTube playlist. Strange Fruit is Billie Holiday's most provocative, unique, and famous song. It is a song that protests the lynchings of African Americans in the South, and it was written by a teacher named Abel Meeropol. Billie Holiday's recording of 1939 is nothing less than haunting. It gradually became Holiday's best-selling record. The most famous recording of the song since Holiday's is probably Nina Simone's. Simone herself was very influenced by Holiday's singing, although their versions of Strange Fruit are quite different. Make sure you listen to Strange Fruit on your YouTube playlist. Near the very end of her life, Billie Holiday participated in a CBS show called The Sound of Jazz. Physically quite frail, she still recorded several numbers with several jazz all-stars of her day. Roy Eldridge and Doc Cheatham played trumpet, Milt Hinton played bass, and Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, and Gary Mulligan, and her good friend Lester Young played saxophone. You can see Holiday, Young, Hawkins, and Mulligan in this photo. This is a photo from the recording session that brought us the tune Fine and Mellow. This is the tune that's on your YouTube playlist and also in your listening guide. Now, Holiday was more known for her renditions of jazz standards, like Without You, than for her singing of blues, such as Fine and Mellow. Fine and Mellow is one of the few 12-bar blues she recorded, and it is clearly one of her masterpieces. Ella Fitzgerald had one of the most virtuoso voices of the 20th century. She had a vocal range that spanned 3 octaves, like that of most trained opera singers. Excellent diction, clear timbre, perfect intonation, and natural phrasing mark all of her performances. Most importantly, she was a master at singing scat. As you'll recall, scat in jazz is when vocalists use their voice as an instrument, singing on nonsense syllables. By the mid-20th century, being able to scat complicated rhythms and melodies had become one of the marks of a great jazz vocalist. We'll hear a bit of that later on, but for now make sure that you listen to her first hit, A Tisket, A Tasket. A Tisket, A Tasket was recorded in 1938 with the Chick Webb Band. Just a year earlier, Fitzgerald had finally made it by winning the Apollo Theater Amateur Night Talent Contest. Incidentally, this contest still takes place in the current day. A Tisket, A Tasket could not be more different than Holiday's Strange Fruit. As you can see from this screen, the words come from a 19th century nursery rhyme. They refer to a children's rhyming game. The melody line is equally simple. Ella Fitzgerald's musically more interesting pieces come later on. In the late 1950s, Duke Ellington and Fitzgerald collaborated on a set of recordings that feature both of them at their best. Their rendition of It Don't Mean a Thing If You Ain't Got That Swing showcases Fitzgerald's virtuoso scatting and the tight ensemble of the Ellington Band. Make sure to study the listening guide for this performance. And with that, we end our study of jazz women vocalists. There were naturally other great voices of the 20th century, voices such as Sarah Vaughan, Anita O'Day, Nancy Wilson, Cassandra Wilson, and more recently, singers such as Diane Reeves and Esperanza Spalding. You can check these out too on YouTube and other places on the web. As noted at the beginning of this video, throughout much of the 20th century, women who wanted to play in mixed-gender jazz bands met a fair amount of resistance. A woman might be a pianist, like Mary Lou Williams, or sing, like Billie Holiday, or even play a string instrument, but playing a wind instrument or the drums was perceived as at least unseemly. That said, there were all-girl groups, such as the Injunies, who you can listen to on your YouTube playlist. This is a group that was flourishing in the 1920s. They toured through the United States as well as abroad. Also, we've already talked about the all-girl group, the fictional all-girl group that appears in the 1950s comedy Some Like It Hot. During World War II, there were literally hundreds of all-girl bands that sprouted up. Some, like the Spitalny Hour of Charm Orchestra, played light dance music and only occasionally incorporated the syncopated rhythms and improvisation we associate with jazz. But the music of other soloists and groups swung as hard as any boy band of the time. In all cases, image was important. You can see this from the photo of the Hours of Charm Orchestra on your screen. Another really important issue and significant issue was race. Most all-girl groups were single-race groups. Segregation was an issue here, just like it was elsewhere in jazz. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm were exceptional in that they were a mixed-race group that toured nationally and even internationally. The band was initially started with the girls at the Piney Woods Country Life School in rural Mississippi, and then as they grew famous, the band's directors, recruited young women from throughout the United States to be part of their band. The group featured some very accomplished female instrumentalists. Do watch the excerpt from one of the documentaries made about the group on your YouTube playlist. Then study the blues tune, Do You Want to Jump Children? It's on the YouTube playlist as well as in your listening guide. You might ask yourself, if you hadn't been told, would you know that this was a performance by female musicians? This screen concludes our video on women in jazz at the mid-20th century.